The county extension agent told Dale Harmon he was throwing away the future. Standing in Dale's kitchen on a February morning in 1983, coffee going cold on the table, he said it plain. "You sell that 80 acres, Dale, you're selling the heart of this operation." Dale nodded. He'd heard the same thing from his banker, his brother-in-law, and half the men at the elevator. He sold it anyway. 2 years later, every one of them would be standing in front of a lender, begging for an extension on loans they could no longer service. Dale Harmon would be standing in a paid-off field, watching the sun come up. But let me back up, because this story doesn't start with a sale, it starts with a boom. In 1976, Dale Harmon was 31 years old and farming 480 acres of mixed ground in eastern Nebraska. Some of it his father's, some of it rented. 80 acres of it, the southeast parcel along Whitetail Creek, was his best ground by a wide margin. Dark soil, level as a tabletop, never flooded, drained well, held moisture deep into August. It pushed 145 bushels of corn per acre in a dry year. In a good year, 165. Every farmer in the county knew that ground. Several of them had tried to buy it at one time or another. Dale's father had turned them all down. In 1976, corn was fetching $2, $70 a bushel. Land in the county had climbed from $400 an acre to $900 in 6 years and showed no signs of stopping. The USDA was talking about global demand. Russia was buying. China was buying. Grain terminals were backed up for miles. Dale's neighbor Harold Kinser had just bought 120 acres at downturn $100 an acre and was already talking about buying more. Everyone was expanding. The philosophy was simple. Land only goes up. Buy everything you can. Leverage the equity. Plant every acre. The boom would last forever because this time was different. Dale expanded too. He'd be lying if he said he didn't. He took on a second 120 acres of rented ground in 1977. Put in a new grain bin system. 4 bins, total capacity of 60,000 bushels. Financed over 7 years at 5% interest. Monthly payment, $140. He upgraded his planter. Bought a used combine to replace the one he'd been running since 1969. Borrowed $28,000 for it at the local Production Credit Association. Total debt load by the end of 1977, $74,000. Not terrible, not uncommon. Half the operations in the county were carrying twice that. The yields were good. 1977, 148 bushels per acre on the creek ground, 120 on the upland. Corn at $2. $40, he grossed $119,000 on the crop. After inputs, payments, and rent, he cleared $31,000. He put $18,000 back into the operation, kept $13,000. Felt good, felt like it was going to keep feeling that way. Then the interest rates started moving, not all at once. That's the thing about how these cycles work. They don't announce themselves. In 1978, his operating note renewed at 11. 25%, he noticed. Mentioned it to his lender, Bill Schrader at Farmland State Bank. Bill smiled and said inflation was a fact of life and that asset values were keeping pace. Dale's land was worth more every year. His equity was growing. The debt wasn't getting heavier. It was getting lighter relative to the collateral. That was the logic, and it wasn't wrong exactly. It was just incomplete. 1979, operating rate hit 13.5%. 1980, 15.25%. By the spring of 1981, Dale was renewing his line of credit at 17%. 17%? He did the math at the kitchen table one night in March, the adding machine tape curling off the edge onto the floor. At 17% interest on a $90,000 operating note, he was paying $1,300 a year just in interest before he bought a single bag of seed or a gallon of diesel. His fixed payments on the bins and the combine added another $18,000. He needed to gross $33,000 before his first input costs just to service his debt, and grain prices weren't keeping up. Corn had softened. The Russian grain embargo in 1980 had taken a bite. Corn was at $2. $90 in the spring of 1981, higher than the late 70s in dollar terms, but the dollar itself was buying less. His input costs had climbed. Seed was up, fertilizer was up, diesel was up. The squeeze was quiet, but it was real. He ran the numbers 3 ways. Best case, corn at $3. 10 at harvest, 140 bushel average, everything goes right. He clears $22,000, middle case, corn at 2 on. 75, 125 bushel average, one significant repair. He clears $8,000. Worst case, corn at $2. 50, 110 bushel average. Prices fall further, interest stays elevated. He loses $11,000 and draws down savings to make his payments. He looked at the worst case for a long time. The problem wasn't one bad year. A farmer can survive one bad year. The problem was that his debt structure had no tolerance for a sustained correction. If prices fell and stayed down for 2 or 3 years, which they had done before, which history showed they were capable of doing, his equity cushion would shrink faster than he could rebuild it. The bin loan had 4 years left. The combine had 3. The operating note renewed every spring. One bad renewal, 1 year where the bank looked at his balance sheet and decided to tighten terms, and he'd be negotiating from a weakened position. He started watching his neighbors. Harold Kinser had bought another 80 acres in 1980 at $400 an acre. Financed the whole thing. His total debt load was somewhere north of $280,000, and Harold had mentioned at the elevator one day that his interest costs alone were running $42,000 a year. Dale had done the math on Harold's situation without saying a word. Harold needed corn at $3, $50 just to break even. Harold was telling anyone who'd listen that prices would come back. Dale had a different read. Not because he had special information, not because he was smarter than Harold. He just kept doing the math, and the math kept coming back to the same place. He was too exposed. His debt-to-asset ratio had climbed from 28% in 1976 to 41% in 1981. Not catastrophic, but trending the wrong direction at exactly the wrong time. He needed to reduce leverage. The question was how. He could sell the rented ground, but that was rented. He didn't own it to sell. He could sell the bins, but they were income-producing assets, and selling them mid-loan made no economic sense. He could sell a piece of machinery, but that would hurt his capacity without meaningfully reducing his debt. Or he could sell land. He owned 3 parcels. The home place, 160 acres with the house, the shop, the infrastructure, the drilled well, the machine shed. He couldn't sell that. The North 80, decent ground, some sandy spots. Good in a wet year, difficult in a dry one. And the Creek 80, the best 80 in the county. He sat with it for 2 weeks. Did the math every night. The North 80 would sell for maybe $95,000 in the current market. Selling it would pay off the combine loan, the bin loan, and put $49,000 against the operating note. It would cut his annual debt service by nearly half. But the North 80 was marginal ground. If he sold it and then things stabilized, if interest rates came back down and prices recovered, he'd have reduced his productive capacity without getting much for it. The Creek 80 was different. In the spring of 1982, that ground would sell for $1,600 to $1,800 an acre. Call it $136,000. That number would pay off everything, every note, every loan, the bins, the combine, the operating line, all of it. He'd come out with $44,000 in cash. He'd go from 41% leverage to 0. He'd be farming 400 acres, the home place plus the rented ground, with no debt and a cash reserve. The logic was brutal and clean. Sell your best asset at full value before the market corrects, eliminate your debt entirely, and survive whatever comes next on a lean operation with no fixed costs. He told his wife Ellen on a Sunday after church. She was quiet for a while. Her grandfather had farmed that creek ground. Her father had been born a quarter-mile from it. "You really think it's going to get that bad?" she asked. Dale said he didn't know how bad it would get. He just knew he didn't want to find out while carrying $90,000 in floating rate debt. Ellen said, "Then we sell it." He called Ron Tecklenburg, who'd been trying to buy that ground for 6 years. Ron had money and didn't ask too many questions about why Dale was selling. They agreed on $1,250 an acre. $132,000 closed in 30 days. Dale wrote checks the same week. The bin loan, paid. The combine loan, paid. The operating line, paid in full with $41,000 left over. He put $30,000 in a CD and kept $11,000 in operating cash. The news traveled fast in a county of 4,000 people. By the following Wednesday, Dale had heard from his brother-in-law, 2 men from his church, and his own mother that he'd lost his mind. The consensus was that selling your best ground was something you did when you had no other choice. When the bank forced your hand, when the sheriff was coming, Dale had done it voluntarily, and that was something people couldn't square with a man who still had equity. He must be in worse shape than he's letting on, they said. Something's wrong over there. Why else would he sell the Creek 80? Harold Kinser found him at the co-op in April and didn't bother to lower his voice. Heard you sold Whitetail Creek to Ron Tecklenburg. Dale said he had. What in the hell are you going to do without that ground? That's your best producing acres. Dale said he'd manage. Harold shook his head slowly. The way you do when you've decided someone else has made an irreversible error.
Dale, that ground was your equity engine. You just sold your future. Dale bought his seed and drove home. Summer of 1982 was hard, dry. Corn struggled on the sandy ground. Dale's upland acres averaged 98 bushels. Without the Creek 80 pulling his average up, his total production was down significantly. He grossed $71,000 on the crop. After inputs and rent, he cleared $19,000. It wasn't a good year, but he made it with no debt service eating into his margins. Every dollar he cleared was his to keep or reinvest. Harold Kinser had a worse year on the numbers. His yields were similar, maybe marginally better on his creek-adjacent ground, but his debt service consumed $42,000 of his gross. He cleared $6,000 on a year where he'd grossed over $200,000. He told Dale at the elevator in November that he'd had to draw on his home equity line to make his fall payment. He said it would turn around. He said prices had to come back. They didn't come back. Not the way Harold needed. 1983 broke open the crisis that had been building for 3 years. Interest rates, while beginning to ease from the 1981 peak, were still punishing farmers with variable rate debt. Land values, which had climbed without interruption since the mid-1960s, stopped, then softened, then began to slide in ways that made the optimists quiet and the pessimists reach for their phones. Corn prices fell below $2, $50 at harvest. Input costs remained elevated. The equity cushion that lenders had been pointing to as proof that farm debt was safe began to compress. Dale watched it from the outside. His operating costs in 1983 were inputs, fuel, and rent. No debt service. He planted 320 acres, the home place plus the rented ground, with no bank telling him how to structure the year. When corn hit $2, $40 in October, he could wait. He had $30,000 in the CD. He didn't have to sell into a weak market. He stored half his crop in his own bins and sold in January when prices firmed to $2. 65ers. He cleared $24,000 on the year. Not spectacular, but clean. Harold Kinser sold 160 acres in the fall of 1983, not voluntarily. His lender had reappraised his land at the new lower values, and his debt-to-asset ratio had breached the covenant on his operating line. He had to reduce debt. The ground that had appraised at $1,400 an acre in 1980 sold for $880. He lost $520 an acre on 160 acres, $83,000 in equity gone. He restructured what was left. He'd be making payments for another decade. By 1984, the full weight of the farm crisis had settled across the county. 6 operations within 12 miles of Dale's farm either went through bankruptcy, sold under distress, or restructured debt under the Emergency Farm Credit Act. Men who had been farming their family's land for 3 generations handed keys to lenders. Dale had gone to school with 2 of them. He sat across from one of them, Jim Ballweg, at a Farm Credit Services restructuring meeting that spring. Jim's eyes had the look of a man who hadn't slept right in a year. He'd been carrying $340,000 in debt at variable rates. His land had dropped $200 an acre in value. The math had finally closed around him. Dale didn't say much at that meeting. There wasn't anything to say that would help. What he did do in the fall of 1984 was buy 40 acres, not the Creek 80. Ron Tecklenburg wasn't selling that. 40 acres of upland ground that a retiring farmer was selling at $620 an acre. Dale paid cash, $24,800. The ground needed lime and some drainage work, but it was solid producing ground at the right price. He'd cleared enough in 1983 and 1984 to buy it outright and still maintain his operating reserve. He did it again in 1986, another 60 acres at $580 an acre. Cash, $34,800. He was buying in a depressed market with no leverage, which meant his cost basis was permanently below what prices would be when the cycle eventually turned. The county extension agent who'd warned him against selling the creek 80 stopped by in the fall of 1986. They stood in Dale's machine shed, looking at his equipment, and the agent said, "You knew, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. Dale shook his head. "I didn't know anything. I just couldn't make the debt work on paper." The agent was quiet for a moment. "Harold Kinser filed last month." Dale nodded. He'd heard. "He was carrying too much," the agent said. "We all told him his equity was his protection." Dale said, "Equity doesn't make your payment when prices drop. Cash does." The agent left and Dale went back to work. He would think sometimes about the Creek 80. He drove past it twice a week on his way to town. Ron Tecklenburg farmed it well, kept it up. The dark soil produced the way it always had.
There were days in the mid-'80s when things were tight and the operation was lean, that Dale would wonder what it would have felt like to still own that ground, to drive past it and know it was his. Then he'd do the math again. If he'd kept the Creek 80 and sold nothing, he'd have entered the crisis with $90,000 in debt and shrinking collateral values. His operating note would have renewed each spring at the discretion of a bank that was now tightening credit across its agricultural portfolio. He'd have been one bad harvest away from the same conversation Jim Ballweg had. One poor decision away from the same outcome as Harold Kinser. He hadn't sold the Creek 80 because he knew what was coming. He'd sold it because the math said he was too exposed to whatever came next, and whatever came next couldn't be worse than losing the whole operation, trying to protect one piece of it. That's the thing about strategic sacrifice that most people miss. It doesn't feel like strategy when you do it. It feels like loss. It feels like the men at the co-op shaking their heads are right about you. It feels like you've made an error you can't take back. The validation doesn't come for 2 years. And in those 2 years, you have to live with the doubt. By 1988, Dale was farming 420 acres with no debt and a cash reserve that let him operate independently of what the credit markets were doing. He wasn't rich. He wasn't celebrated. He was still driving a truck with 140,000 miles on it and eating lunch at home instead of in town. But the operation was his. The bank didn't own a piece of it. No lender could call a note and rewrite the terms. No appraisal could compress his equity to the point where he had to make decisions under duress. He bought the Creek 80 back in 1991. Ron Tecklenburg had decided to retire and offered it to Dale first, as a courtesy. The price was $890 an acre. Dale had sold it for $150. He bought it back for $890. He wrote a check and didn't say a word about the difference, because Ron Tecklenburg hadn't done anything wrong and the market wasn't anyone's fault. But Dale understood the arithmetic. He'd sold the ground at the top, eliminated his debt, survived the crash, bought back into a depressed market with no leverage, and ultimately reacquired his best ground at a 46% discount to what he'd sold it for. He now owned it free and clear, with a stronger balance sheet than he'd had before the sale, at a cost basis that made it one of the most profitable pieces of ground in his operation. He didn't tell the story often, wasn't the type, but when his son Mark started farming alongside him in the mid-'90s and started talking about expansion, about borrowing against the operation to buy adjacent ground at climbing prices, Dale sat him down with the adding machine and ran 2 sets of numbers. The first assumed prices stayed elevated in the loan service cleanly. The second assumed a 30% correction in both prices and land values and showed what the debt load did to the balance sheet under those conditions. Mark looked at the second set of numbers for a while. "So what do?" he asked. Dale said, "You figure out how much pain you can absorb if the worst case happens. Then you make sure you're not past that line. Because the worst case always has a chance of happening, and the time to prepare for it is before it does." Mark said, "Even if it means selling the best ground?" Dale picked up his coffee. "Especially then, because that's the only ground someone will pay full price for before the bottom falls out." There's a lesson in this that goes beyond farming. Leverage works beautifully on the way up. Every dollar of borrowed money amplifies your gains when assets appreciate and margins expand. The danger isn't visible until the cycle reverses, and by then, the debt structure that felt manageable becomes a fixed cost you can't escape. The farmers who survived the 1980s farm crisis in the best shape weren't the ones who predicted it. They were the ones who'd built operations that could absorb a correction without requiring a perfect outcome to stay solvent. Dale Harmon didn't have a crystal ball. He had an adding machine and the discipline to believe what the numbers told him, even when everyone around him was telling him the numbers were wrong. Would you have sold the best 80 acres you owned? Not the marginal ground, not the problem acres. The ground that produced 165 bushels of corn in a good year that everyone in the county coveted, that represented everything your family had built. Would you have sold that to eliminate debt before a crisis that hadn't arrived yet, when people were calling you foolish for doing it? That question is harder than it sounds, because the social cost of that decision was real. The isolation was real. The doubt was real. The years of driving past ground that used to be yours, while men at the co-op shook their heads. That was real too. Strategic sacrifice isn't painless. It's just less painful than the alternative. If this story made you think about leverage, risk, and what it actually means to build something durable, subscribe for more stories about the decisions that separate operations that last from operations that don't. Drop a comment. What would you have done with that Creek 80? And share this with someone who's being told that growth is always smart and that the answer to every problem is to buy more and borrow more. Dale Harmon sold his best ground, and everyone said he was done. A few years later, he was still farming. A lot of the people who said he was crazy were not. That's not luck. That's not a trick. That's what happens when you do the math and trust it, even when the math costs you something you love.